have a friend, he's an imagination teacher for preschool.
Of course you do. Like, that is the most Zanita sentence ever. Also, what do you call this clap?
I don't know.
Freak of nature.
I just can't do that. So
No, I can't do it either.
I had an example of
Ugh, my wrist hurt.
Don't use
Are we
your
recording?
wrist. You use your fingers.
We are recording.
Are we actually?
Yeah.
This is going on the outtakes.
This is great content.
This is great content.
All right. "2024 was here, and it's soon going to be gone. And I am here with the Signs of the Times team to talk about the year that was. I'm here with Jarrod. Say hello, Jarrod.
Hello, Jarrod.
I'm
sorry. I can't help it. It's fun.
And I'm here with Zanita. Say hello, Zanita.
Hello.
And I'm Jesse, of course, your trusty host. And we are back for another edition of our end of year roundup episode. This has become something of an accidental tradition, I think, for us.
Surprisingly, the people love it.
Well, that's the reason that we keep doing it. I mean, we're shameless shills when it comes to what people want.
I keep thinking, do they really want to know this?
Do they love it, or is it just
Apparently.
that we go on break for a while and there's nothing else to listen to?
I mean, if you're sitting at home during the December-January break and you have nothing to do, I can imagine nothing else that you'd want to do than to re-listen over and over and over to the last episode of Science Radio for the year before. I think there is no greater entertainment than that.
Yeah, with all the thousands of podcasts available. Surely they could.
They don't compare, clearly.
Maybe they love it then.
We used to joke that it was the Zanita effect because it was, I think, the first time Zanita was in the studio, which the first one was not a studio. It was my living room, I think, my kitchen table. And now we are actually in a studio, which is very exciting. And if you can see the video, then you can see how exciting that is.
I would like to know what the stats say about the episodes this year because I haven't been in that many and you've done some awesome episodes. So
Well, this year has
is it
definitely
really the Zanita effect?
there's definitely been a change for this year, and we're going to talk all about that. We're going to talk about the year that was, and we're going to talk about our favorite episodes of the year, but we're also going to talk about the wider world, and we're going to talk about some of the stories that we weren't able to cover in Science of the Times magazine or on our website or in the podcast that we really would have loved to, because I don't know about you guys, but I felt like this year a couple things happened. A few things. It was somewhat noteworthy in terms of the wider goings on in the world.
Yeah, here and there.
Here and there. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But first we're going to talk about our favorite episodes of the pod this year. Jarrod's going to talk about his favorite, then Zanita, and then I will do some self-reflection and some shameless self-aggrandizing. The irony is not lost on me. But Jarrod, what was your noteworthy episode this year for the pod?
This is a difficult question, Jesse. There have been some fantastic episodes this year. I just want to say, before you get to self-aggrandizing, thank you and well done, because the podcast, I feel, has gone to great heights this year. I love the new sort of format, the way you edited other clips together, the dramatic, interesting introductions leading into some really good interviews, guest interviews, etc. I'm a little bit biased when it comes to the episodes that I favor. I love human stories, testimonies, life stories, the drama, the interest, the highs and the lows, and how we follow those threads through. And so, honorable mention to Kelly Pepper, with his fame and his leukemia battles and his wrestling with whatever it means to be human, and then becoming a pastor. Like, his story was cool. Jamie Lean was talking about demons and drugs and darkness and how he escaped from that and how Jesus changed his life. So like those are right up there. But I think my favorite was Moesha's story. I think Zanita had that conversation with Moesha well before the Olympics. It was just one of those God things that when the podcast was coming out, when the article was coming out, there was a lot of Olympic buzz around, and we did that on purpose. We knew we wanted to feature an Olympian, but to have a person who has some faith, as Moesha does, even though she wrestles with it, I liked the honesty of her interview and the fact that she's a Christian, she's in the spotlight, she doesn't have it all together. She's had a challenging run of injuries and difficult, circumstances, but she made the Olympics. And we interviewed her. I love the fact that we interviewed her not as an Olympic medalist or even an Olympian yet, but as someone who had qualified for and was going to their first Olympics. That was exciting. After we did the interview, after we were putting the story together, she qualified for another event. She ended up then winning silver in the open water swim. And I watched that swim, and it was one of those funny things because we'd interviewed her, because I'd just been listening to her testimony. I was like watching her race, rooting for her, like, let's go Moesha, because I felt like I knew a bit more about her. And that was an epic moment of the Olympics. Like, she led much of the way. She had this, tooth and nail battle with this other really high profile. Like, this lady was experienced, the eventual winner, the gold medalist. And just to see that the bravery and the fight that she showed in that race, like, it meant, in hindsight, even more to have had the interview with her on Science Radio to re-listen to or think about her story now that she was an Olympic silver medalist and the heights of that sort of thing. So, yeah, for me, that was a real standout. In reflecting on the year, I was like, wow, we actually got the opportunity to talk to her, and we made her famous before she was famous. But seriously,
it's very gratifying to see somebody of faith who has had such a really quite an extraordinary story. The lengths to which she went through to actually qualify, and the providential God moments as well, are quite extraordinary. And the fact that she's had those providential God moments, but she's also worked really hard.
Yes.
And she doesn't just make the faith community or her family proud. She actually got in a moment to make her country proud, and that was, I think, for me, it was a very patriotic moment, which doesn't come around very often, I think, for me personally. But it was very gratifying to see that.
Everyone wanted to speak to her after she won that medal, and it was nice to be like,
first.
we had her first, like, she's ours, our Moesha. So that was a really nice moment. I will say, I know I'm being a bit cheeky here. But Up to the Cup, which just came out recently, tying together the story of, street level gambling, the social issues it causes, seeing that firsthand through the eyes of Sam Luteru, who works at Adra Logan, and also the guy from the organization Up to the Cup, and the cruelty to animals and some of the other social ills that you guys discussed, the alcohol, that sort of episode tied together for me 2 or 3 separate storylines in a really cohesive, coherent way. And props to you, Jesse, as well, for pulling that together. So well done on that one. I just want to mention that episode as well, because, like, guys, if you haven't listened to it, go and have a listen, because I thought it was a really professional, amazing storytelling, really well done. So, I've got a lot of favorites. Moesha probably takes the cup this year. She takes the silver. But some of those were definitely worth for me mentioning. So,
I think with Up to the Cup particularly, that's something that we've been quite strident about as a ministry. There are certain issues that I think we are going to keep coming back to because they're just not going to go away. Interestingly, I saw a fairly famous YouTuber talk about betting apps in America. It's a fairly recent development, recent being in the last 5-10 years. Australia has been absolutely the proving grounds for a lot of these betting apps to really just demonstrate how profitable and how manipulative these tactics can be. Because in the United States, you can't gamble anywhere except for Arizona. So Las Vegas, Nevada, excuse me.
Nevada.
You can't gamble anywhere except for Nevada in Las Vegas, but you can bet on a phone. And obviously, Up to the Cup has all sorts of different issues, but in terms of gambling in general, it's something that I think Australia has been a test dummy. Obviously, Australians pour hundreds of millions of dollars into gambling anyway, so it's a pretty lucrative test dummy. But it's something that is going to the rest of the world, and I think we should definitely keep an eye on that, as well as just the horse racing industry in general. It is definitely Up to the Cup is gaining ground in Australia in terms of its wider appeal. So it'll be really interesting to see in years to come the level to which acceptance of horse racing will either diminish or not. And we'll be across that, I think, as we go.
I don't really have that much experience with gambling and don't really know anyone who has had a gambling addiction. But after I listened to your podcast, I went to it was just like a little pub in Coolangatta to hear some of my friends play, and there was all like these betting machines, and the races were on, and there were like probably half of the people in that pub were just going to these machines because one person started it, he won $20, and then everyone was just like, "Oh, he won $20, let's go!" And it was like such a big thing, and I was like, "Wow, like this does seem alluring." I would like to win $20. So it's just, I guess, something we don't see that often because now everyone's doing it on their phones, but it is a pretty big issue. But also exceptional storytelling at the beginning of that podcast. I felt like I was listening to an audiobook. I was like, I feel like I'm at the races. This is great.
You guys are going to need to be careful because my ego can only take so much.
That's all right. We'll cut you down later.
Fantastic. Love it.
I think it's nice that Signs as a team, like we've made this a conscious effort to tackle social issues that are bad in the world. We're coming from a Seventh-day Adventist perspective, and our forebears, our pioneers of the faith, they were very strong on slavery. They were very strong on alcohol. Obviously, it was this time of prohibition, and things were in the future, coming close to when the church was started, and they were unashamedly like, this is what we do as a people. This is our principle. This is our stand. But also, they were sharing that. They were advocating for it as a lifestyle, a way that can help. And the things like, we've also talked about vaping this year. As an Adventist, I don't smoke, never have no temptation to do the vaping or anything. But it's a huge issue where we've almost eradicated smoking in Australia, and yet this vaping is like creeping in. And even the church, I haven't really seen say anything about it. Like a lot of these, the gambling on the phone and whatever, we might be like not traditionally going to a TAB or a pub and betting in those places or book. But I wonder how many even people of faith are getting sucked into the gaming or the gambling on your phone stuff that you've talked about, Jesse. And so it's good for us to stand up and have an opinion, and it's a space we can advocate for. And at the end of the day, it's about compassion for our fellow humans and helping them to have abundant lives. Because even if they don't believe in God, these things are diminishing their quality of life. And we'll probably talk more about alcohol later, but alcohol, smoking, gambling, these are things that we've got
a unique voice in this,
We've got background in this.
Yeah.
We've done this. Yeah. And Signs has done this for, we've done 130 odd years of, good, wholesome stuff, and we can keep that tradition going, which is a nice sort of thing for our looking back, reflecting sort of moment that we're having.
It's interesting that you mention that because, if you look historically, 19th century, the century that birthed the Seventh-day Adventist Church, many, many Christians in that era were very socially and politically active. Ellen White was a proud sort of supporter of the teetotaling movement, and a lot of these social movements. And it seems that, at least in recent years, Christians have been on the back foot for a lot of these social issues. And I suppose there's a multitude of reasons why that is. But as a result, it often feels like we're behind in actually being advocates for people having holistic health. And it's not just about people's eternal souls, which is the classic Christian mantra, but actually, as Adventists, we have a really beautiful message that encapsulates not just the soul, but the body and the mind. And to be at the forefront of that, I think, is really important. Zanita, how about you?
This was really hard. I started going through the list and was like, yeah, that one. Yeah, that one. Yeah, that one. I was like, I've got to choose. So honorable mentions for the one we did recently, presidents and their daddies, I found really interesting. I also really enjoyed the one that I recorded, which was titled The Problem with Men, where I went into a men's shed, and that was just a fun one to record. Like
that was a fun one to edit as well.
Yeah, like I was just with a bunch of men in a woodwork shed, talking about like retirement, male loneliness, and like they were a great group of guys, but also especially we had an interview with Richard for this podcast, and I just really loved his like intentionality about his life, about connecting with people and serving. I thought that was really cool, and it was just fun to be amongst that group of men.
It was an immersive experience. I don't know how you did this, Jesse, but editing that podcast, I was listening to it and I could smell wood chips. I don't know how you did that.
It was fun. Yeah.
Yeah, it felt like I adopted 20 grandpas that day, which was awesome. But I wanted to especially mention the first podcast that we did with this new format, which was the fertility cliff. That was episode 201. And this was the first one we did in that new format, which I really like the new format because a lot of the times you'll pull out like excerpts or people saying something and you actually hear them say it, which I feel like in podcasts, you often listen to people saying, studies say this and this person says this. And I'm often like, did they really say that? Or what study was that? Or like, you know, you just hear so much and a lot of it sometimes is contradicting that. It is like really nice and helpful to hear actual people saying things that isn't just us. Because I could say anything and you might not know that that's true, or you might doubt that. So I really like the new format and I liked that like process that we experimented with this episode. But I found this episode, although it is like a sensitive topic, it's controversial. She makes some really bold claims that I think still need a lot of like study backed up behind them. But I thought it was helpful considering it's something that consumes so many women's minds. I think times are changing a lot at the moment, and not only are people getting married later, people are struggling to find a partner. And like I put a story out on my Instagram before this conversation with Cece, just kind of asking people how they felt about fertility, the ticking clock. Were they worried about it? Were they chill? Well, like, was it affecting their relationship decisions? Which for a lot of them it was, because it's just always been something that I think has been kind of pushed down people's throat. And even the idea of like the fertility cliff, like, you're 30, when you're 35, like it's just going to go poof, like. And although I think, you know, obviously as we age, conception is going to get more difficult and more complicated. That's just a reality. But I think some things we can't control. And I thought Cece's perspective was just helpful in like, okay, well, what can we do to increase our chances of having a healthy pregnancy later in life now? And how can we like eliminate some of this fear and start thinking in a healthier way? Because I don't think I've really heard a lot from that perspective because, you know, like I had a conversation with someone at the Christmas party yesterday and we were kind of talking about this idea of, sure, everyone or a lot of people, they want to like get married young or find their partner young and then just kind of have a family and it'd be like this relaxed, beautiful thing. But if you look at society now and if you look at kind of what's happening, that's not like, you can't just schedule that in your calendar. Like I would have loved that story, but I didn't meet the right person in my young 20s. Like stuff just happens. And so you kind of have to, I don't know, I guess adapt with the culture and like be as positive as you can, because I think science is telling us more and more that like stress does have a really big impact on our bodies in ways that we don't fully understand. And so it's not super helpful
Definitely,
the situation.
it definitely feels like the world that we live in is becoming more stressful or
Yeah.
stress-inducing.
Yeah, and so I thought it was just a refreshing conversation that we had with Cece, which I found personally really helpful. Just like as I'm aging.
Mm. And fertility, I think, is more of a topic of conversation even now than it was 12 months ago. Fertility was a huge issue in the recent US election, and
Yeah.
it's become an incredibly politicized issue as well. It's seemingly a reason why a lot of people are choosing to even step away or step toward religion. So it's probably something we'll have to revisit in the future. But yeah, definitely it felt like a much more pure conversation back then, but it's become much more complicated in
Yeah.
recent memory.
And I don't think it's as simple as I think Cece kind of alludes in it that like
Yeah.
don't stress, just eat good, and you'll be having children in your 80s. Which
I think it's all very
obviously-
well for somebody living in Hawaii to say that.
Yeah,
All love to you, Cece.
Yeah, we still need to be wise and we still need to plan, but I think it's like, well, what can we do if things don't go as we hope? Like,
Indeed.
Yeah, I guess that's why I enjoyed it. But.
Good.
Jesse,
Mm.
it's your turn.
Well, look,
Give us the goods.
I'm not going to spend any time on honorable mentions because I think you've probably both taken all my honorable mentions, which is absolutely fine. When I look back at the year, there's a lot of good stuff there. I think my favorite episode for the year is episode 213, Climate Refugees. And I think I probably mostly put it on this list because it was the most difficult one to put together. It was originally meant to be coinciding with either the June or July issue, the month where we had World Refugee Day. So it was either June or July. I can't remember off the top of my head. But long story short, it didn't quite work out that way because the topic of refugees kind of became a bit bigger than originally intended. Originally, we were just going to sit down with Greg Young and talk about refugee issues to do with Ukraine because we had a little bit of a sort of focus on Ukraine for that particular issue. But I also got to talking to a couple people, and the topic of climate refugees became part of the conversation. And so I thought, well, it might be interesting to do a big double episode, but it ended up kind of being split into 2 episodes because the conversation got so big. The previous episode we talked to Greg Young, and then this one we talked to Dr. Tracy Mafileo and Taupo Tani, and as well as Sahara Anai from New Zealand, all those 3 from New Zealand. And they talked a lot about some of the very pressing climate issues happening right now in the Pacific. And it's interesting, look, you put these things out into the world, and especially when it's a topic that's a little bit controversial, of course, climate change is a little bit of a political issue, people push back in various ways. And it really struck me that there's this whole sort of political discourse about climate change happening here in our comfortable Western sort of bubble. Meanwhile, folks in the Pacific are literally seeing the effects. They talked about the increase in cyclones, the degradation of coastline. Sahara, I believe, spoke about a village in PNG where the entire village is basically, it's half underwater at this stage. And so these people who have been ocean people for however long now have to pack up and move into the mountains and become mountain people just to escape the effects of rising seawater. Taupo is from a little island nation far away called Tuvalu, which, like other places like Kiribati, are literally being kind of worn away by the seawater. And so it was difficult to put together. The reception was interesting. Some people are, open to hearing these perspectives. Other people are not so open, and that's fine. It's their prerogative. But I think it's interesting, and it's important to keep highlighting stories like these because I don't think we should be blind to what's happening in our Pacific neighborhood. And we are all part of the Pacific neighborhood, as they kept reminding me in our conversation, that even though we're here in Australia, and folks listening in New Zealand might feel like we're a world away, really the Pacific is on our doorstep, and we are part of the greater Pacific community. And so we have a responsibility to the folks in those places. So yeah, that was probably one of the more difficult episodes for this year, not just in putting it together, but also in creating a narrative that isn't politicized, because that's not what we're about, but is also honest with what's happening in the world. And so trying to strike that balance was difficult, but, well, some people might have opinions on whether we achieved it, but I think it's still important to tell the story.
And to talk to the people
That's right.
involved directly,
Yeah, 100%.
Instead of getting a climate change politician.
That is the last thing I wanted to do. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
I think some of that opposition that you received, one common criticism in an attempt to sort of shut down conversations like this from people like us is like, well, you're Christian, so you should focus on sort of other things. And I guess the way we look at it, just to pull back the curtain a little bit, is that Signs of the Times is our brand. It's our MO, if you will.
Yeah.
And these things are being talked about in the world, are happening in the world. They are signs of the times that we're living in. Now, whatever people think about exactly how close we are to the end of the world, a lot of this is in the Bible. We know the climate will be messed up. We know people will get sick. There will be wars and rumors of wars. All the things that we're seeing happening in our world are there. But also, that's been done to death in some senses in the Christian sphere. Like we hear that from a lot of different sources. What we're trying to do at Signs of the Times is to really emphasize the hope that Jesus gives us, because although we know the ending and the outcome, and there's some things that happen that aren't pretty, ultimately Jesus is victorious and he gives us that hope. And so I guess we're entering these conversations with trying to be a fresh perspective in that space, and to bring the hope that Jesus gives us into those signs of the times. Yes, we're engaging with the signs of the times, but we have a space to help people live more abundantly and to give them hope that it's not all doom and gloom on the horizon. Even when things seem terrible, there's an opportunity for us to speak into that with hope and with life as Christians. And so I guess, people say, why do you cover these issues? Why, people might listen to some of the episodes that we've done and go, that wasn't very spiritual. You didn't have a lot of faith stuff.
There wasn't an altar call at the end of the episode.
What's the point of doing some of this? And I think the point is we're being alert. We're aware of what's happening in the world. We're helping people to see that it's not all doom and gloom. There's ultimately a redemption plan, a rescue plan in place, and we believe that. And also, it's important to look at this stuff and to understand how the world is unraveling, working, trundling along, because people are interested in that. If it bleeds, it leads, we say in the in the newspaper industry, in the journalism industry, and people want to know some stuff that's bad, but we can, in our privileged position of knowing God, knowing Jesus, and knowing that he's got the victory, we can actually bring hope and life into some of those difficult spaces and those bad headlines.
Not to be too theological, but I think a lot of the discourse becomes quite fatalistic in the whole, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, but don't worry, Jesus is coming. It's like, okay, well, it's not very appealing to a secular person.
Very passive approach. everything
it's
down.
like you're creating an enemy, and the enemy is Satan, and by extension the world that Satan controls, and everything's terrible, and all we must do is remove ourselves from it and then hope that Jesus comes before the tidal wave of evil and anarchy reaches us. Theologically, though, God's plan of saving humanity, which began with Jesus, is and working through the early church, is still in place today. And God's plan is not to destroy everything and wipe the planet clean and destroy it and then create something new. It's restoration. God doesn't want to destroy us; He wants to restore us. God doesn't want to destroy our world; He wants to restore it. And the end of the story of the Bible doesn't end with us sitting in a cloud in heaven, plucking a harp with wearing a toga. It ends with new heaven and new earth, a heaven and earth restored, and God coming and making His home among us, just as He wants to make His home in our hearts right now. And so, as Signs of the Times, that's my conviction to share that hope, love, and joy, the peace that passes all understanding, that can only happen when we put our trust in God, that goes beyond the situations and circumstances we find ourselves in. Yeah. So that transcends politics. It transcends creed. It transcends, all these other things that can get us so bogged down in our little echo chambers. Anyway.
At the end of the day, there's so many things happening in the world that are so controversial because everyone has a different opinion on something. And if we were just to avoid all of the things that were controversial, we would be doing a disservice to what we try and do, which is give hope, like a hopeful perspective on the world today. So it's hard. It's always going to be hard, and we're always going to have people who are annoyed at us for talking about certain things. But
I really liked that article. Is the world actually getting worse? Was that in this year, or is that coming in
that's
early?
January,
that's
Feb.
coming soon.
Jan, Feb next year. So
Yeah.
I'm foreshadowing.
Ooh.
Give some people some hope. Is the world actually getting worse? Someone's actually looked at some of the stats and said, well, actually the world's not getting worse, which is challenging to our narrative if we're just trying to scare people into heaven.
Yeah.
But it squares with Jesus trying to restore things. If, we still believe things will probably get worse before they get better. But at the end of the day, God is working through humanity, and it's going to go up and down. It's going to be a roller coaster, but we need to be discerning and understand where God is working and where it's just broken world just doing its thing, playing out.
All right. Well, enough self-congratulate. Enough
Self-congratulations. Felicitations and congratulations.
The other part of this episode is talking about some of the stories that happened in the world that we would have liked to cover, but for one reason or another, we are unable to. So, Jarrod, what is the story that really piqued your attention this year?
Yeah, we've done some of this in the past. So Signs has been going for a while. Some of us have been involved for a while. Each year in my memory, we've done something around this space, but not this year. Violence against women, domestic violence is making the headlines again and again. And it's something I've written about in the past. It's something I'm passionate to see us addressing because it's just a widespread and horrific problem. There's been some high-profile cases. News.com.au is running a series of articles that's been exploring how victims of even sexual abuse or domestic violence have such a difficult time in the court system, as in it's stacked against them. The court process is drawn out, so the victims give up because they're cross-examined and their reputations and their social medias are dragged through the mud to try and discredit them. It's a really messy process. And then I believe in Australia we had this law that someone on trial for that kind of thing could even get character references. And so you've got someone accused of doing something, they're going through due process, and even if they get accused, they can present people saying, oh, but he's such a wonderful person. She's an upstanding member of the community, you know, even though she's accused of these things. You know, we've always found her very good. And so there's even some fairly young people campaigning to get rid of some of these laws, to change some of this legislation, because it's just really difficult for the survivors of the trauma that's been inflicted. So, you know, I think the stats are horrific. You know, some of the deaths of women of a certain age in this country, the highest sort of is intimate partner violence and things like that. It's horrific. It ties to some of the things we've been talking about: alcohol, gambling, major sporting events. Yeah. Allegedly, when the All Blacks lose, domestic violence goes up in New Zealand. You know,
I think it's not just that. I think it's also when the All Blacks play in general. Even if they win, it's not as bad. But even when they play,
it's a shocking thing that, you know, yes, we can celebrate the heroes of the sporting field, the champions and stuff, but what is the human cost of some of those things? We have to count that cost at some point, and we have to reckon with ourselves. You know, we had the Olympics this year. I think in the past we'd written about a soccer World Cup and the amount of sort of prostitution and sex trafficking, exploitation of women happened in those cities, those countries around those events. And so, yeah, it's very easy to look at the big picture headline events, the silver linings. We celebrated the Olympics this year. It was great to have Moesha, as I mentioned before. But we have to recognize that there's a seedy underbelly sometimes to some of this stuff that really just goes untalked about and unaddressed. And I definitely think with domestic violence and things like that, awareness is definitely a big part of the taking away some of the power of this problem is awareness. You know, more people understanding and knowing what's about it, more women and men who get affected being equipped with tools to understand what is violence, coercive control, not being able to access your friends and your bank account. Well, actually, that's a bit shady. Like you got to start asking questions, and how do we, as people who may not be affected directly by that, how do we help and support those who have been? And so, yeah, I just did a quick look at our website. Saw a bunch of stories we've done in the past addressing this issue, but this year, even though it's been somewhat prominent in the news cycle, we haven't necessarily done anything about it. And it goes just back to our faith is to treat all people equally. Men and women have value in the eyes of God. Jesus lifted up the downtrodden, especially women, in his ministry and his role when he was living out his earthly life. It was very obvious to certain gospel writers that Jesus was picking out women specifically to lift them up and to have them to be part of the story, even though the cultures around them didn't have that same value on women's lives. So, yeah, I think for us in modern life, we often think, oh, feminism is winning. The sexes are equal now. You know, we have
job done. Go home.
We have men lamenting that.
Yeah.
We always do stuff for women and not for men. Well, woe is me. But there's definite, like the domestic violence, intimate partner violence, the sexual assault and abuse that happens even in so-called developed countries like Australia and New Zealand is just horrendous. Yeah. And I, you know, as you can see, I'm passionate about it. I really think that we can be a voice, as we spoke about gambling and some of the other issues earlier. I think we can speak out. It fits with our Christian values to be anti-violence. It fits with our Christian values to lift up women and to support the vulnerable and to support the survivors of some of these horrendous things. Even sex is something we don't talk about a lot as Christians. We sort of push it under the rug and have certain attitudes and opinions in our community that aren't always healthy, and they aren't always a holistic Christian, God-focused ethic of sex. And so some of this stuff we can address. I think.
Mm.
I'd like
Get
to
ready
see us.
for the sex episode coming soon to a podcast near you. Not hosted by me. No,
Come on,
but
Jesse, come.
no. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's something we should talk about a bit more.
I think it's always there's like topics like this, topics like they're sensitive topics or they're uncomfortable topics to talk about. So it just gets more difficult. But obviously, there's also so many things happening in the world, and it's like, where do you start? It seems like every day there's a new headline,
Yeah.
and so it's like we've covered awesome things this year, and we haven't been able to cover it all. But I guess it just sets us up for things to aim for 2025.
100%.
Yeah, it's encouraging in some ways. We just don't have capacity to cover everything, but this opportunity of reflection again and looking forward, this gives us an opportunity to say, hey, next year we can do a story or two in this area. There's an opportunity there for us that we can explore doing.
I'm looking forward to
see
that.
it.
Cool. Zanita, how about you?
Yeah, this is also one of those topics. It wasn't really news. Well, it was on many news headlines, I guess. But I was, I guess, just thinking today about all the different things that have happened, and there were so many things that we would have liked to have covered, but we just didn't have capacity or time, or we're a small team. And I think this is something that we've produced many like financial help pieces in the past. I don't think we have this year, but I feel like this year, the last couple of years, maybe since COVID and cost of living has increased, we haven't really covered that at all, which I guess is just surprising because I feel like it's something most people our age are stressed about. It's just like the rise in cost of living, living situations like rent. Are we ever going to own a house? Is that like a possibility for our future? Like a lot of people kind of wondering, am I going to have to move away from my friends and family to like live somewhere else where I can afford? Like it's just something that I think is consuming our minds daily. And yeah, we just don't know what's going to happen. And I just like looked at some stats, and it was in the last few years, housing affordability has grown by 36%. And currently, 25% of people are feeling significantly more stressed due to the rise of cost of living, which is, that's a quarter of Australians that are feeling significantly stressed.
That's millions of people.
Yeah, that's millions of people. And I know just speaking to my friends, speaking to my family members, like people are stressed about it. Like, and we don't know what the future is going to look like. And so I think that's something that not just the cost of living prices increasing, but also like there's been a massive increase in homelessness, which is something that I think would be interesting to cover because we don't really hear from those people firsthand. Like those people are in the dunes, those people are on the streets.
And they're marginalised, and so they don't get a voice.
And also I heard recently that like the average median age of a homeless person is like in their 50s, which it's like they've got like half a life
that's
of us.
scary.
Like that's so sad. And they're like our people, and they're like literally like they're on our streets, and we see them, and we just don't realize like what they, I guess, what's the word I'm thinking of? The lack of life that they get to experience. Like you're talking about, we really want people to have a good quality of life. And these people are just really not experiencing that. And so, yeah, I think that's something that would be really awesome to cover next year as well, and something we didn't really address this year.
This is something that I think has affected you quite a bit this year personally. Hey, you've had to move a couple times.
Moved multiple times, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I had to move out of my house recently because my rent went up and we just couldn't afford it. We had a new baby and we were going down to a single income. And thankfully, we had parents-in-law to move into their place, and that's the only way that we could financially make it work as well. So we're all feeling it in different ways, but one thing for sure, we're all feeling it. Yeah.
I'm surprised by that stat that you mentioned with the average age, because I've heard recently from sort of youth homelessness advocates and about how so many young people are finding themselves on the streets, teens and stuff. They get kicked out of home for lifestyle choices or whatever, falling out with their parents, and they just find themselves on the streets. But to hear that, the average actual age is a lot older, like 50s, old. If you're averaging ages across a lifespan where most people are living to 80, right? That's at the upper end of that. So that's interesting. And I think we have talked about doing some stuff on homelessness. So I'm hoping early next year or sometime next year we can really find some leads, sniff them up, follow them up, and sort out all the problems in the world. We'll fix them.
Maybe
we'll at least bring awareness to the
Yeah.
the issue and have a good science take on it.
Sounds good.
Jesse, yours.
So mine's maybe a little bit out of left field. In June of this year, Julian Assange got released from the UK prison where he was at that point being held. And he was flown to a little island and given a court hearing where he was not cleared of all charges, but there was a plea deal that he and his lawyers entered into, and as a result was able to come back to Australia and is currently, as far as I'm aware, living as a free and mostly anonymous as a private citizen here in Australia. And this is a man who obviously has made the headlines feels like decades now. I don't know exactly how far it goes back, but he really became famous for releasing a lot of classified documentation on his website, WikiLeaks. And along with figures like Edward Snowden, I think really changed the face of how we as a general public, how we relate to government secrets. And so previously to that, it seemed like government secrets were the sort of thing that everybody just kind of accepted. All right, well, they're going to be locked away in a vault and we're never going to know. Whether it was, JFK's assassination or aliens in Area 51, these sorts of things, or probably more realistically, war crimes and things like that the government really doesn't want people to know about. These are things the public is never going to find out. And here comes Julian Assange and Edward Snowden and people in his team, and they really changed the face of how the general population relates to their government and government agencies and government officials. And I think that in many ways, maybe it was intended, maybe not so, but I think Julian Assange really affected the political discourse around politics, around war, particularly foreign policy, things like that in the world today. And I think there's a higher level of skepticism, and there's also a higher expectation that governments and government bodies will be transparent. And we recently had a case here in Australia where a former Australian Army lawyer was fighting the Australian government and the Australian Army for leaking documents of war crimes, and he's actually gone to prison because of it. And I think we're going to see more and more of this in the future because a lot of people are much more skeptical about their governments than they used to be. There's no sort of, I think there was always some level of skepticism that some people had toward the things that the army was doing, the things that the government was doing at high level. But now there's a much wider dissemination, a democratization of information, and call it a sign of the times. But I think that this is definitely, I hope that Assange is going to have a relatively normal life from here on out. Hopefully he doesn't do any more illegal things to get him into further hot water. But I do think that this is probably, the Pandora's box has been opened on this sort of thing. And I think that the future of information technology has been forever changed because of it. So yeah, I think it's a relatively small story in the grand scheme of 2024. I mean, we haven't even talked about the US election. We barely touched on it in the magazine, so we probably could have talked about that a little bit more. There's many other things that we could have mentioned, but that's what I've been thinking about, at least.
So what's the angle?
I think the story is around how we relate to our elected officials and the expectation of how those elected officials disseminate information about their doings. Now, the big issue, of course, is national security, and agencies all around the world have a high level of interest in keeping national security and national secrets, just that, secret. But what we've I think, seen in the Snowden files and in WikiLeaks is that the government can't always be trusted to do the right thing. And so the question is who gets to kind of, it's like who watches the Watchmen kind of question, who gets to have a say in what the government does and what the government is allowed to do and what the government should be allowed to do. And I think, Assange's stance has always been, well, if it's out in the open, then the public can make their pleasure or displeasure be heard depending on how things go. And government agencies can be held to account, and government and people can be as ultimately held to account for the things that they do. Now, of course, you can go super political with this. If you're on the right, you would just want to go after the left. If you're on the left, you just want to go after the right. But I think it's bigger than that. I think it's about public trust, and I think it's about being part of the democratic process. And being part of that process is if there's information out there that we have access to, well, then that gives us a level of responsibility. I think you could probably take this back to the cost of living thing. There's multiple think tanks and agencies that have pointed to the fact that the cost of living crisis in the world has primarily been driven by corporate greed, and that's been continually ignored because governments don't like that, because governments have relationships with big business. And that's not a political left or right thing. It's happening on both sides. And so when it comes to things like that, I think we owe it to ourselves as the general population, as the public, to discuss this because, well, if we don't, then who will, sort of thing. And so there's levels of expertise, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in any of these things, but I think as long as we're having the discourse, then I think that can contribute to the greater conversation that's happening around some of these issues. So
I think it also raises the question, because obviously we're talking about the government and if we trust them, and Australians are very untrusting of their government. We're in the top few countries that distrust our government the most. And so what do you do in a society where you can't trust the people who are leading the joint? And that's obviously many Australians don't trust the government. So how do we speak into that? Do we support it or do we not? Do we tell them to trust them or do we not? And maybe we can't answer those massive questions, but how can we help give them hope in those circumstances?
The Apostle Paul has some advice for us where he says to pray for your elected leaders.
And I think it's quite appropriate as well because Paul is
in prison for...
well, and exactly, because he's taking for granted that the leaders of the nation are evil. I mean, he is suffering under, an evil emperor, and he will be executed by Nero, one of the worst emperors that Rome ever had. And so if he's telling his followers, he's telling the early church to pray for evil men who are controlling the empire, how much more do we have a responsibility as Christians to pray for and to be part of the civil process for leaders that perhaps are not evil per se, but with whom perhaps we have some serious disagreement?
It's a very radical solution because he sort of talks about praying for and participating as far as possible and going along with law and order.
We have an incredible privilege that early Christians did not have, that we live in a democratic society. They did not. And we can be part of the civil process. They could not. And so I think we absolutely owe it to ourselves as Christians to not be necessarily part of the civil process if you don't feel like that's your calling to become a politician or whatever. But I really admire organizations that are part of the civil process, organizations like Micah, with whom I've had a little bit of dealings, who actually have as part of their mission to speak truth to power in a way that is not advocating for themselves, but for those who don't have a voice. And I think as Christians, we 100% have a responsibility to do so as well.
Seems to be the theme of our conversation today. Do we have any expectations for next year before we finish up?
That's an
What's the
excellent question. Well, okay. For me, I think out of this conversation, I'd really like to delve a little bit deeper into sexuality and relationships. I think that would be a really interesting, potentially brave thing to do in the right way, because I think that it is just so core to so many of the problems and human suffering. Yeah, that's a big one for me. I think that would be really fun. We've done a little bit on we've done a lot on relationships, I should say. I was going to say we also have done a little bit on pornography, which is an element of some of that relational dysfunction. Probably haven't done enough on that. We probably need to do a little bit more in that space. But I think wider space. Yeah, we were created for relationships. We were created for compatibility with another being emotionally. And sexually. So that's something I think we should explore a bit more.
What about you?
I asked the original question. We're going around.
He's
just wanted to
biding
make sure
his
you didn't miss
time.
out.
I need more time. I'm thinking. Still thinking.
Like you said, Jarrod, I am really passionate about people's stories, and we did do some awesome ones this year, but I would like to see that be every issue kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because I think, yeah, we can look at the stats and we can give hope, but I think there's nothing like hearing someone live a life and go through stuff and come out the other side and like share how they got through to the other side and share their struggles, because I think that is really inspiring. Like, I'm sure you've all heard stories from people in regards to things that you've also struggled with and found that really helpful. I know I have. And so that is one thing that I would like to, focus more on in 2025. And also what I've spoken about, I think homelessness is something that I haven't really heard that much about. I don't really know what to do about, because there's a lot of, societal things around that it's like, we have this idea of all the homeless people are just on drugs and they could get help if they wanted. But is that really the case? And like, should we really be that reserved or that blindsided about it, I guess? Like, they're just people who also need help. So that's something that I would really like to kind of zone in on and look at and cover.
My hope for 2025, I think, is slightly more abstract than that. I'd love to do all that stuff, but I guess just to look for more opportunities to shed light in the darkness, to continue to stand by what we want to do at Signs of the Times, which is to share the faith, the hope, and the love of Jesus with a society that's becoming more and more secular, less and less biblically literate. They don't know who Jesus is, and we have an opportunity to share him with them. And so I'd like for us as a team and for others who'd like to join us in telling their stories or writing for us or jumping on the podcast because there's a topic they're passionate about, like, we're going to need help to do this well. And so I guess for me, in my role, looking for partners to help us. Jesse, obviously, we talked about broadening our stable of writers, if you will, getting more, commissioning more stories, finding more people, and potentially bringing you guys, our listeners, our readers, more in the space on our website, in the podcast, so we can, just get a bit more of that capacity that we've talked about, telling more of these stories. Important to be across all of this stuff. So there's definitely some things we've touched on today that will be great topics for 2025, and so much more. Who knows where the Lord will lead us next year? But thanks for facilitating this conversation, Jesse. I think it's good to reflect and to look forward as well.
Yeah. Well, I have had a lot of thanks directed toward me this episode. So let me just take this opportunity to thank both of you, Jarrod, for your leadership and for your fearlessness and your wisdom in leading this ministry. It's been a hard year for all of us, I think, and at the same time, I think it's been a really rewarding year. I feel lucky that we get to do meaningful work and we get paid for it. It's our everyday job, and yet it sometimes, most of the time, sometimes, most of the time, doesn't feel like a job. It feels like a privilege to be part of this. And Zanita, thank you for your just absolute, what's the word? Just
Verve.
your verve, your vivaciousness. The word I'm thinking of is like you cannot be
Zest
beaten
for life.
down. Like you're just unrelentingly positive
Optimistic.
and optimistic. And even though I know you've had a hard year as well in many different ways, you've been to Southeast Asia and
Hard.
that was really difficult, I'm sure, climbing in Nepal. But at the same time, yeah, you've been a fantastic member of the team. And though we don't get to see you in the flesh as often, your presence and your contribution, I think we would be missing out so much if we didn't have it.
Definitely the rose between the thorns, Jesse.
Oh, yes. Oh, that goes without saying. And I guess finally, and perhaps most importantly, thank you to all of our listeners and our readers. If you are a supporter of Science, we don't really give our supporters, our donors, much of a shout out, but we do have a wonderful, wonderful series of supporters who really make this ministry go. And we wouldn't be able to do this without you. So thank you very much if you've been a long listener, a short listener, medium listener, a supporter, a reader, anything that you've done. If you've shot us a prayer or an encouragement, we really appreciate it. And we can't wait to see where Signs of the Times goes in 2025. So if you're listening to this at the end of December when it is published, hope that you have a very happy Christmas, that you take some time to rest, recuperate, to take stock of the year, to eat too much food, to feel full, and to do what you need to do to see the new year in healthily and with hope. And we will see you again in the new year. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jarrod.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zanita.
You're welcome.
We'll see you all in the new year. Bye, everybody.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.